Hey, we're back here with Chapter 8 in Dr. Vaughn's book, The Power of Critical Thinking, and we're going to start and work through analogy and causal arguments today. And I want you to look at, we're going to start on page 281 in the 5th edition and kind of work from there. Here's my agenda. This is Chapter 8. This is B and C. I'm going to walk through both of those today and basically just give you a bunch of things to think about before we get to the actual work of the chapter. Okay. In Chapter 8, we have this idea of analogical induction. Okay. And analogies are really just comparisons among two or more things that happen to be similar in certain ways. Now, probably from your literature class, English class, back in middle school and high school, you learned about metaphors and similes, okay? Things that are compared, one with another, one using like and as, one not using like and as, and you have this kind of poetic idea, right? We take something like T.S. Eliot saying, "The evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table." Maybe not poetic, but interesting, okay? As cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. You have these juxtapositions of something concrete with something less concrete. When we're talking about analogies, we're talking about things that are alike in certain ways. And in logic, we have a couple of different ways of looking at this, okay? Analogies tend to have a certain format, okay? Analogies look like this. If I have an analogy, most of the time I have kind of an A is to B as C is to D, okay? A and C are very much the same category. B and D are very much the same category. And they're alike in the same way. Now, lots of folks love these things and they're great at them and they can be very obscure. My brain doesn't work this way very well, okay? So I can get this one if I have kittens are to cats as, oops, too many dots, as puppies are to dogs. That makes sense to me. Baby, mama, right? Much more complex than that, I lose it, okay? Now, what we're talking about here resembles this, but it's not exactly this, okay? We're using an analogy for analogies. Kind of odd, but it's Dr. Vaughn, so you know. An analogy looks at similarities among different things, okay? And we're using analogy as our logic, as our argument, then we get to be a little more complex than just one thing at a time, okay? So we have a couple of things, well, more than a couple of things to look at with this. When we have an analogy, we're looking at similarities, and we're also sometimes looking at dissimilarities, or disanalogies. Similarities, yeah. Okay? So I'm looking at this thing A, whatever that is. And it has certain attributes, okay? Certain properties, okay? That's my P here. Certain properties. So it has properties 1, 2, and 3. And 4. Now, thing B has properties 1, 2, and 3. So it probably has P4 as well. Okay, property 4 as well. And that's my argument kind of structure. Okay, so if I know that thing A and thing B are alike in these 3 relevant ways, we're still in enumerative induction here. It has these 3 relative properties. Thing A also has this 4th property that's relative to the others. So thing B probably has that P4 as well. okay, that property for as well. And when we're looking at an analogical induction here, we're looking at analogical arguments, this is our pattern. This is what we're trying to figure out. Now, looks pretty easy, right? But this is the hard part. Sorry, left out my finger. We're looking at properties that are relevant to our conclusion. And sometimes what we think is relative doesn't really give us the conclusion we need, okay, or the conclusion we've made. And so we have to be careful when we're looking at other folks' arguments to see that the properties they're looking at as relative really are relative to the conclusion. Okay, that's the big jump here. So we have a few ways of figuring out how or whether those things actually will work. Okay, and 3 out of 4 of these come from a philosopher whose name is John Stuart Mill. He's an English philosopher, early 20th century. And so we have to think about a couple of different ways this can work. He's given us 3 ways to think about arguments. Well, he's given us a lot more than that. We're going to use 3 of them. The first one is this method of agreement. Okay? Our method of agreement, am I in the right spot? No, I'm not. Shut up and forget that part. We're going to forget that. We didn't talk about John Stuart Mill yet. That's in the green part. Sorry, that's for things. I have the wrong page on here. Ding! Okay. Thing 1, thing A, thing B, properties 1, 2, 3, probably has P4 as well. We're looking at things that are relevant similarities. Okay. These are things that actually have a direct bearing on our conclusion. Okay, our relevant similarities have a direct bearing on the conclusion. We can talk about all kinds of things whenever we're talking about analogies. And it's sort of like when we're talking about the parking issue in the last video, whether you drive a muscle car or a Prius, doesn't really matter. You still need a parking space, okay? So those would be irrelevant. What we're looking at here are similarities among our 2 things, between our 2 things that have a direct bearing on the conclusion. The more of these we have, the more likely our conclusion is true. Remember, we're still working in probabilities here. This is inductive logic. Now, relevant dissimilarities, things that make our particular issue more difficult, okay? They have a direct bearing on our conclusion. Things that make our thing A and thing B different, that could make it impossible for our conclusion to be true, okay? So again, direct bearing on the conclusion, the more of these we have, the more relevant dissimilarities we have, the less likely our conclusion is to be true, okay? Now, there are 2 other things that we can look at that can help us make a better conclusion. One, okay, I'm going to lay up here because that's too low, is the number of instances compared, okay? So if we're looking at the number of properties, relevant properties we have, how many of these do we compare? The more of these we have, the more likely our conclusion is to be true, or that we'll be able to make a true conclusion, okay? These count as cases, okay? So the more we have, the more correct or probable our conclusion really is. Okay? So say thing A and thing B have 27 relevant properties. That's a lot. Okay? And 27 means that number 28 if it's relevant to those other ones, is probably true, okay? So we want to figure out how many cases we're comparing, how many properties we're comparing, and the more we have, the better our conclusion can be, okay? The other way is the idea of diversity among the cases, okay? When we're talking about our properties here, how diverse are they? How many different things still behave the same way, okay? And Dr. Vaughn gives a really good example of that at the top of page 286, okay? One of the things here that we're looking at is when our differences, this diversity here, when they count, they're not coincidence, okay? Not coincidental. Or contrived. We have not stacked the deck, okay? Then the more we have, the more correct our conclusion can be. Okay? All of these things build into how accurate, how strong our particular argument is when we're talking about an analogy. We can link a whole bunch of stuff together, none of it be relevant, and we have a very weak argument. Or we can link just a few things that work really well, okay? They're diverse, they make sense, they're definitely relevant, and have a stronger argument, okay? This is especially important when we're talking about medical pieces, scientific pieces, all of those. And we have lots of different kinds of analogies, okay? I was showing you if the cats are to dog, kittens are to cats as puppies are to dogs. That's a pretty basic analogy. When I'm talking about an argument by analogy, we're looking at relevant similarities versus relevant dissimilarities. We're looking at the number of cases we have, number of properties, and we're looking at the diversity among those properties, okay? The other kind of analogy that Dr. Vaughn gets at and doesn't talk about very much is this idea of a literary analogy, okay? We are comparing two things, and we're also doing it kind of poetically. We're not trying to show an argument, really. We're just saying, you know, look at the sunset. The sunset is this beautiful color, but we're trying to figure out a good way to compare it to, okay? Because not everybody's purple is the same. Okay, so my thing about the sunset is this is a lovely lavender sunset. Reminds me of the lilacs in my parents' backyard. Okay, that gives you a basis. Okay, a literary analogy really just compares two things in one aspect, and it does so more poetically than what we're getting at with an actual argument. Okay, so when you get to exercise 8.6, pretty easy to tell which ones are literary and which ones are actual arguments. But when we look at arguments, we have to look at how well they do things. That whole evaluation part, right? We're trying to figure out how probable is the conclusion based on the evidence we're given. And our evidence is our relevant similarities, relevant dissimilarities, how many instances or properties we're comparing, and how diverse those particular cases are. And that's pretty much the idea of analogy in this chapter, okay? Go back and read. Remember, ask questions if you have them. Send me an email, okay? I'm going to move to the other stuff. We're going to see what we can do here. Erase the board. Now I get to talk about John Stuart Mill a little bit. Sorry about that bobble earlier, but you know, I don't edit these guys because, Lord, That's too much time and weird, and my other students don't get me edited, so here we go. Causal arguments. Causal arguments are hard. Not hard to evaluate, but hard to be true, okay? It's very difficult to show that one thing actually causes another, okay? And a causal argument has a causal claim, okay, which is just a statement about the cause of something. And when we try to prove or support a causal claim, we make a causal argument, okay? And that's what the last part of this chapter is about. It starts on page 289, okay? When we're looking at a causal argument, this idea of cause is difficult to prove or support. Just because something comes before something else doesn't mean it causes it, right? So we have to think about how well our evidence shows this particular causality. And this is where John Stuart Mill comes in, okay? He says if you have a causal argument, okay, and we're going to talk about all the things that can get in the way of that in just a little bit here. But when you have this causal argument, you have 4 different ways that you can show causation, okay? The first way is the method of agreement. Okay, and the method of agreement basically says, and I need to turn the page here, right? Ding. If 2 or more occurrences of a phenomenon, okay, phenomenon, state of affair, whatever, have only one relevant factor in common, that factor must be the cause. Okay? So, if one relevant factor, then that's the cause. Okay? Pretty easy, right? There's only one thing different from here to here. That one different thing is what caused it. Okay? Then we have the idea of the method of difference. And that basically says if this particular factor, this relevant factor, is present when the phenomenon occurs, and then we take that relevant factor away and the phenomenon can't occur, then that relevant factor is what caused it, okay? So this is if the factor is present and the phenomenon occurs, then, and absent when it doesn't, then that's the cause. And just for a little practice, okay, so if the factor is present when it occurs, okay, so if P and not P, then Q. Wow, that's fun. We don't want to do that truth table, right? The other kind, there are 2 other kinds here. So we have method of agreement. If there's one relevant factor, then that's the cause. Okay. Method of difference, if the factor is present and the phenomenon occurs, but absent when it doesn't, then that's the cause. Let's get rid of this so that doesn't mess people up. We can combine those 2, method of agreement and difference. Okay. Basically, we have one main factor. Everything only happens when it's there. When it's missing, nothing happens. Okay? So, one factor. Present means it occurs. Absent means it doesn't occur. Okay, this should be a big fat and. Okay, put them together. Our last one is correlation, okay? Or in Mill's words, concomitant variation. Okay? We like this part. This is like traditional causation, okay? The cause varies, increases or decreases, as the effect varies, okay? So the cause varies, it increases or decreases as the effect varies, okay? Sounds pretty logical, right? In medicine, we call this the dose response. Okay? Think anesthesia. The more anesthesia you're given, the longer you stay asleep. Okay? Or the more cigarettes you smoke over a longer period of time, the greater your chances of cancer, emphysema, those kinds of things. Okay? So the dose response is a correlation, a concomitant, and all that means is a together with together, redundant much, variation, okay? So as one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down, okay? Cause and effect, dose response. Now, when we get tested for causes, okay, so when we do this part, we've already gone through and eliminated all of our causal confusions, okay? And this is not easy. We have a lot of things that can get in the way or that can discredit our idea of a cause and effect, okay? So my causal effect, my causation here, I have a bunch of things that can confuse me, okay? So here are my confused causes. First of all, and this starts on page 296, misidentifying relevant factors. Okay? Either I identify something as relevant when it's not, or I don't identify something as relevant when it is. Both of those things can get in the way and mess up something that we think might be causal, but it's not really, okay? Or we agree that it's not causal and it really is, okay? Our ability to identify these relevant factors depends a lot upon our own expertise and background information. This is why we do research, okay? We want to look at why something causes something else, or does something cause something else. And so we have to go look things up. We have to do the research. We have to increase our background information so that we can accurately identify all of our relevant factors, okay? So this can go either way. Missing something or adding something that really doesn't work, okay? The next one, mishandling multiple factors. This happens all the time, okay? Most of the time, when we're looking for causal connections, we figure out that there are not very many ways we can make this work, okay? Sometimes, because we've misidentified our relevant factors to begin with, we think we have way too much to work with, okay? When we have a lot, and most of the time, honestly, we have a lot more than we think we do. All the variables that go into figuring out what's the reason for the failure of my computer, okay? All the possibilities, okay? First thing, is it plugged in? Is the power source actually plugged in? Okay, is it turned on? Does the button still work? Are my connections all good? Did I drop it on its head? Messed up connections? The list goes on and on and on and on, right? Do you have Windows 10? You've got problems. So many factors get lost because we don't even know to think about them. And so when we're looking at causal arguments, we have to be careful that we're looking at all the possibilities before we say X caused Y. Okay, so it's a lot of work. Next, we have being misled by coincidence. Lots and lots and lots of things just happen, okay? Now, if they make you go, it's probably not a coincidence, okay? This is another one that goes in either direction. A lot of times we think something is caused by something else when really it's just a coincidence. It just happens this way, okay? Have you ever had a friend's name or a past event kind of cross your mind, and the next time you look at your email, you've got an email from this person, and you think, whoa, did my thinking about that actually cause that to happen? Probably not. The fact that you are friends, you do kind of, have things going on, the chances are that, you're both thinking about each other the same day, pretty high, okay? The other pieces here, if you think about coincidence, lots of things happen every day. I mean, you just ask your friend, so what happened in your day today? 20 minutes later, you might have sort of a sample of their day. All the little things you do. How many steps does it take to get from where you are to the next bathroom? Okay, lots of things can happen between there and here. Lots of that is just coincidence, not important, okay? When we're looking at causal arguments, we have to make sure that what we're seeing as a cause isn't just circumstantial, isn't just a coincidence, doesn't really make the difference between X happening and Y happening, okay? So we have to be careful. We have to look at all the possibilities. Another one, okay, I'm going back up here, I know I write backwards on the board, is being confused by temporal order. Okay, this is the, just because X came before Y doesn't mean X caused Y. Okay, it can't go the other way. Your cause can't come after your effect. But we have a lot of things that just because I said hello to Monica and then I tripped and fell in the hallway. My saying hello to Monica did not have anything to do with me tripping and falling in the hallway. I'm just clumsy, okay? Temporal order, okay? And Dr. Vaughn gives us a whole bunch of kind of temporal order issues. Anything that you get here, okay, so sorry to those who have this particular belief, but I wore these socks when my team won, and so I'm not going to take them off again because I don't want them to lose. That kind of stuff isn't cause and effect. It's just silly thinking, okay? Don't assume that a causal connection exists unless you have good reason to believe it. The other thing we have here is confusing cause and effect. Part of this is most of the time we're looking at things after the fact. Can we be sure X happened before Y? If we're looking at somebody else's argument, that's especially difficult, okay? Does your coffee drinking make you feel stressed out? Or do you feel stressed out so you drink coffee? It's a chicken and egg kind of idea, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Okay. And there's one other piece here, and this is a post hoc fallacy, okay? This just means after that, looking at a particular outcome and misreading what happened before it as a cause, okay? One of these, and Dr. Vaughn has this in here as a deadly post hoc fallacy. The post hoc fallacy is basically the same idea here, confusing cause and effect. One of the ones that really gets a lot of press and shouldn't is the idea that vaccines can cause disease. Especially vaccines can cause autism. A very opportunistic scientist published a study that he had faked most of the information in and scared a lot of people. Unfortunately, things like that die a very slow death. There are reasons to be concerned about any medical thing because for different people, some of them are deadly. If you're allergic to something that's in the vaccine, you shouldn't have it, okay? Friends who are allergic to eggs, a lot of the binders that are in our modern vaccines are made from albumin, which is the whites of an egg. It's a really good fixer. It keeps the viruses from being too damaging. But if you're allergic to eggs, you shouldn't take them, okay? There are lots of reasons to be concerned about certain things, but we have to do our own due diligence when it comes to vaccines and all kinds of medical issues. So when we're looking at a post hoc fallacy, taking something that occurred after the fact and using it as fodder for our argument is not only incorrect, but it's unethical. And especially in cases where thousands of people are affected by it. So be careful with those. Make sure you're looking things up in more than one place. Don't just trust things that give you the answers you want to hear. You've heard that before too. The last piece of this chapter that's important for us is the difference between a necessary and a sufficient condition, okay? If I have a necessary condition, okay, it is one that if I don't have it, the thing can't happen, okay? Without which X doesn't happen, okay? As a necessary condition, I have to have, in order for fuel to combust, okay, for your car to go, okay, in order for fuel to combust, I have to have the fuel itself, I have to have oxygen, and I have to have a certain temperature, okay? Any one of those three things not there, nothing's going to burn, nothing's going to blow up, okay? The other one is this idea of a sufficient condition. Okay, my sufficient condition guarantees X will happen. Okay, in the previous example, okay, I have gasoline at a high temperature, oxygen present, we're going to have a fire. I can have gasoline at a high temperature in a vacuum, no fire. I have to have oxygen. oxygen is my sufficient condition because it guarantees that fire will happen. Okay? Now, oxygen was up here with the necessary condition as well. So sometimes my condition can be both, but sometimes it's just one or the other. So just kind of keep those running around your head. That's causation stuff. Okay? When you're looking at exercises 8.8 through 8.10, make sure that you're looking at the conclusion, not just the last sentence. Okay, read through those little paragraphs carefully, maybe a couple of times. Identify your conclusion before you do anything else. Okay, and that's going to be very helpful in figuring out, okay, does this really support this causes that? Okay, that's just my last little note. Okay, so chapter 8, all done. I'll come back with chapter 9 a little later. Thanks.